Have you read War and Peace? It's a long book. Let's talk about it. I reread the novel as I was prepping for that movie adaptations video, and I thought I might as well talk about it now while it's still fresh on my mind. But it's not an easy task, because every bit of research that I did uncovered more layers, more details, more interpretations of the text. And with a book of this volume, you can imagine it's very easy to get overwhelmed and give up. I have not given up, but I've made myself comfortable with the fact that I'm not gonna cover everything about the book, and I might even potentially miss some important parts, and we will have to be okay with that. There are bound to be hundreds of videos on the topic on YouTube, so I'm gonna talk about what appeals to me. To even get you through the plot, I feel like I need one of those murder boards that YouTubers make when they recap the plot of Pretty Little Liars for 6 hours straight. It's probably impossible for me to recap the plot fully here, so I'm gonna mention a few elements here that might not even be conducive to what I'm gonna be talking about later in the video, but at least if you've read the novel, it's gonna remind you of what's going on, and then we will get into themes and all of the fun stuff. War and Peace is set during the period of 1805 through 1812, jumping to 1820 in the epilogue. Tolstoy sets off to depict the period of Napoleonic Wars with the help of a number of fictional and real-life characters. In the opening scene, we meet a few of them. First, Andrei Bolkonsky, a Russian officer who's about to go to Austria to join Russian troops there to fight Napoleon. Andrei dreams of military glory, of his own Toulon. He has these ideas about coming up with a military strategy and in a moment of greatest despair lead the troops to victory. He becomes adjutant to the commander-in-chief of Russian army, Kutuzov, and witnesses a series of defeats for the Russian army, notably in Austerlitz, where he actually gets to partially fulfill his fantasy, wherein he grabs the flag and leads the soldiers forward, but gets wounded. As he lays there watching the sky of Austerlitz, he suddenly comes to the realization how inconsequential and unimportant everything that he's been doing so far is in comparison to this great sky above him. He doesn't even care when his hero, Napoleon, passes by him and remarks on his death, since Napoleon believes Andrei to be dead and not wounded, and Napoleon says what a great death that is with a flag in hand. Andrei recovers, though, and comes home just in a moment when his wife dies in childbirth. Andrei's friend, Pierre Bezukhov, whom we've also met in the first scene, is an illegitimate child of Count Bezukhov, who in his will acknowledges Pierre out of all of his batards and names him his sole heir. Pierre's uncle, Count Vasily, who was also eyeing the will and the inheritance for himself, tricks Pierre into marrying Ellen Kuragina, Vasily's daughter, a beautiful woman but not a particularly smart one, who is also in it not for Pierre's better qualities but for money and status, and she almost instantly takes a number of lovers. One of the lovers is a man called Dolokhov, who taunts Pierre, and that eventually leads to the duel between the two, where by sheer accident Pierre manages to wound Dolokhov. The duel shakes Pierre. He leaves Hélène and St. Petersburg behind, but while he's traveling to Moscow, he runs into the head of Freemasons in Russia, who convinces Pierre that he can help him in his soul searchings, and so Pierre joins the society as well. Both Pierre and Andrei try to implement some changes in the way that their estates are run and to help their serfs, but Pierre is constantly gets tricked by his servants, while Andrei does manage to make some good changes, but it doesn't bring him any joy or contentment. He's lost his drive, his will to live even. The friends reunite, and through a deep conversation between the two and an encounter with Natasha Rostova, Andrei finds his zest of life once again and throws himself into the political life, and specifically into the reforms of Speransky. Pierre, however, returns to St. Petersburg and once again succumbs to the vices of the capital. The next turning point for Andrei happens at one of the balls in St. Petersburg, the first ball for Natasha Rostova. The Rostovs are described as these good, if simple, noble folk. The entire family exudes this warmth, both children and parents, but especially Natasha. There is also Nikolai Rostov. His storyline is all about duty versus heart. Like, for example, when he loses an obscene amount of money to Dolokhov, because Dolokhov has it in for Rostovs, because he proposed to Sonia their charge, and Sonia declined because she's in love with Nikolai. Sonia is a girl without a dowry, but Nikolai loves her and wants to marry her, but the financial state of their family calls for him to find a more wealthy bride, like, for example, Maria Balkonskaya. That's gonna come back later. But first, Natasha. Natasha, she embodies this joy of life, the openness and earnestness of it all. And at the ball, she's this ball of nervous energy. And Andrei, at Pierre's request, asks her to dance. And imperceptibly to the both of them, they fall in love. With this newfound love for Natasha, Andrei finds his political pursuits unimportant and abandons them. But his father is very much against the marriage between Andrei and Natasha. He believes the Rostovs to be way beneath the noble name of Balkonsky. Andrei agrees to wait a year before marrying Natasha as to prove their feelings and leaves for Europe to improve his health. Natasha, who lives in the moment, finds separation almost unbearable and unfortunately falls victim to the charms of Anatol Kuragin, Pierre's brother-in-law. Anatol deceives Natasha and schemes to take her away since he cannot marry her properly since he's already married. Natasha is blinded by her infatuation and is only saved from total ruin by her relatives and Pierre, who sends Anatol away. That's probably the first time when Pierre fully realizes that he's in love with Natasha, and still he tries to reconcile her with Andrei. But Andrei, who before his departure had made it clear that while he believes himself to be bound by his word to Natasha, he does not expect the same from her, and still he's not willing to let go of his pride and forgive her betrayal. He then joins Kutuzov in the military in the hopes of finding Anatol there and challenging him to a duel. That's when the truce between Russia and France is broken and Napoleon marches on Russia, pushing Russian troops further inland. The main battle takes in a place called Borodino, just outside of Moscow, and the battle is lost, so Kutuzov orders a retreat. Pierre, a civilian, finds himself in the middle of the battle and gets to see firsthand what war is like for regular soldiers. Andrei, who's also there, gets mortally wounded by a grenade, and in a medical tent he sees Anatol, who's also wounded, and in that moment Andrei finds it in himself to forgive him and even love him in like a religious sense. The troops retreat, and Kutuzov also orders to leave Moscow, as the troops are in no position to battle Napoleon at the moment, and giving battle would only lead to more bloodshed. Kutuzov believes, and is proven right, that by leaving Moscow they will actually weaken the Napoleon's army, and though they will be forced to retreat. Thus, by losing, they will still win, save more lives. Moscow citizens leave Moscow. Rostovs are amongst the last ones to leave. They actually abandon quite a few of their belongings to make room for the wounded in their carriages. Nikolai Rostov wasn't in Borodino. As the troops were retreating from Smolensk to Moscow, he actually saved Maria Balkonskaya, and so there are these tender feelings that start to develop between the two, but Nikolai is still bound by his duty to Sonia. As Rostovs travel from Moscow, Natasha finds out that Andrei is one of those wounded that they have in their carriages, so they reconnect and reconcile. Natasha takes care of him, and there is even a brief moment of hope that Andrei might recover, but as his sister and son arrive, Natasha tells them that it happened to Andrei, meaning that he has finally embraced death, kind of seen behind the veil and accepted it fully. So while his heart might be still beating, he's no longer with them, and so Andrei passes away a few days later. While Andrei was still on the mend, Sonia, in a sly attempt at self-sacrifice, wrote to Nikolai, releasing him from his word to her, as she hoped that Andrei recovers and marries Natasha, so a marriage between Nikolai and Maria Balkonskaya wouldn't be possible. But with Andrei's death and Sonia's ill-thought-out sacrifice, Nikolai is now free to marry Maria, who, a marriage of love really, but also the one that improves Rostov's financial state, since Maria inherited quite a bit. Pierre, meanwhile, has stayed in Moscow and is completely overtaken by the idea that he is the one who's meant to kill Napoleon. Moscow comes aflame, and as Pierre tries to save a child from a burning building, he gets captured and imprisoned by the French. The French, who were mostly marauding what was left in Moscow, are forced to retreat from the city, being chased out of the country by small partisan units. The French take their captives along with them, and that's where Pierre meets Platon Karataev, a soldier/peasant, a man of the people, who makes quite an impression on Pierre. And so Pierre comes out of his captivity with this newfound love for life and its simplicity. And while that was going on, Pierre's wife had died in St. Petersburg, so he's now free to marry Natasha. In the epilogue, we jump forward 7 years and are treated to the idyllic life of two family units, Pierre and Natasha, and Nikolai and Maria. But conflict is brewing, since Pierre is now entertaining ideas that would become Decemberist's ideas, and Nikolai opposes them. The second part of the epilogue is fully dedicated to Tolstoy's philosophical ideas. And that's the barest of bones. I've skipped over so much, it's not even funny. The novel was originally envisioned as a story of Decemberists returning from Siberia. A few chapters were actually written where Pyotr Labazov, a proto-Pierre Bezukhov, and his wife Natasha returned to Moscow with their children. In one of the drafts to the foreword of War and Peace, Tolstoy writes, 1856, I started a story, the hero of which was supposed to be a Decemberist returning to Russia with his family. Involuntarily, I moved from the present to 1825, but even in 1825, my hero was already a mature family man. To understand him, I had to go back to his youth, and his youth coincided with the era of 1812. If the reason for our triumphs was not accidental but lay in the essence of the character of the Russian people and army, then this character should have been expressed even more vividly in the era of failures and defeats, and thus the story moved even further into the past, into 1805. The first chapters of War and Peace were actually published with 1805 as a title. Tolstoy never fulfilled his original idea. The novel ends with only hints at Pierre's future as a Decemberist, but leaves that narrative thread open. The popular quote from one of the Tolstoy researchers is that he wanted to write one book, but ended up writing a completely different one. Can you imagine how long this book would have been had he stuck with it and continued on until the Decemberist and even further? I wouldn't have been able to lift it up. It's big enough as it is. Even now, it's a long book. It's not just this, it's this as well. Why is it so long? The prevailing opinion on the novel is that it's an epic, so it cannot be short, really. It is often compared to the Iliad, on occasion by Tolstoy himself, and there are reasons for it. Epics deal with the fate of the people, if not humanity itself, while using individual characters caught in the wheel of time to portray it. And that's what Tolstoy did. His idea was to portray the Russian people in the moment of their greatest crisis, at that point at the very least. He depicts a number of battles, the state of the Russian army, the war councils of Napoleon, Alexander I, and Kutuzov, the people of Russia as Napoleon entered the country, and how Moscow was given away to save that said country. I didn't mention too much of it in my recap, but about half of this book is dedicated to the war aspects in every possible detail. The period of Napoleonic Wars was an era of wins and defeats for the Russian state, but it also defined the nation for decades afterwards. The Decemberist movement came from it, and the reactionary politics of Nikolai I were the unfortunate consequence of that failed revolt, and thus, consequently, the reforms of Alexander II were already a little bit too late, and they could have been so much more. That's what we see in the book, the beginnings of unrest amongst the nobility. The searchings of Andrei, and especially Pierre, they lead to Senatskaya Square. But the society at large, so stuffy and crude, the share salon of it all, they are dragging the nobility down since they are so stuck in their ways, in their lesser pursuits, unable to change. But this nobility at the same time represents the golden age of Russian nobility with its emptiness and wastefulness, and it also shows how people like Pierre or Natasha don't really fit in. But Tolstoy doesn't simply care about the gentry, he also cares about the people, the soldiers, the peasants, as he believes that the true meaning of life can only be found there. Tolstoy eventually found an answer for himself in the life of a peasant, as he believed them to be more honest and virtuous than the gentry, and a few choice characters in War and Peace represent that mentality, like Platon Karataev, for example. Tolstoy also believed that the period of great change is where the nation truly shows itself, its true colors, and he praises the Russian people for their perseverance in this war. The magnitude of the task that Tolstoy set for himself, i.e. depicting all of these aspects of the epoch, already merits the page count, but showing is not enough for Tolstoy. He's also looking for answers there. Answers to eternal questions on history, the place of man, free will, and the meaning of life and death itself. He constantly goes on these tangents where he explores these philosophical dilemmas while tying them back to the narrative. And so the book can be tentatively divided into these three parts: war, peace, and philosophy. There are actually many ways that you can compartmentalize the novel, like, for example, family, war, and people, but let's stick with the first one for simplicity's sake. From composition perspective, the novel is divided into 4 volumes, somewhat arbitrarily, really, because it used to be 6. And those volumes are divided into parts, and those parts are divided into small bite-sized chapters. And that's actually both helpful and not. Each chapter is only going to be dedicated to one theme and depicting one specific individual scene, so it's easy to read. But at the same time, what it allows Tolstoy to do is jump between narrative threads. So I can see how it can become annoying if you're, say, very much interested in Natasha's story, and after reading one chapter about her, Tolstoy jumps to something else and you have to wait for 10 chapters for him to come back to her. And indeed, Tolstoy fully utilizes this composition to jump between narrative threads, going from war to philosophy and back within pages. And in my opinion, it makes it easier to read, and also you can put the book down and come back to it much more easily that way. Could the book have been trimmed down? Well, yes, kinda. There was a 3rd edition during Tolstoy's time where he removed all of the philosophical chapters and published them separately as a science article, basically, but that's not the edition that is considered to be canonical. In Russian, we have a saying that you cannot throw out the words out of the song, and so fortunately or unfortunately, the philosophy is part of War and Peace. Because for Tolstoy, these philosophical bits are just as important as Natasha's story, and moreover, one cannot exist without the other, because Tolstoy is not simply telling a story, he's also attempting to analyze it, so every bit is important. Telling Natasha's story is one thing, but looking at the historical, societal, moral, or personal context, that's what War and Peace is all about. And honestly, as far as I can tell, readers mostly have problems with the second part of the epilogue, which does read like a philosophical doctrine. I'm going to be honest with you, I'm fully skipped it on this reread because I was already so fed up with the book at that point. I read it over the course of the week, and I actually do not recommend doing that. Maybe space it out a little bit more, because if you read it quickly, you notice these things. Tolstoy tends to repeat the same thoughts over and over again. And so I got fed up with it pretty quickly. And I was like, okay, I got it, Mr. Tolstoy. Can we move it along? And I could feel that he's going to repeat the same thoughts in the epilogue. So I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. Maybe if you read the book for leisure and without a deadline in mind, you will be perfectly fine with this and you will be happy to read the philosophical part of the epilogue. Who knows? Personally, I also didn't enjoy the war chapters where Tolstoy goes into specific details of the battles and battalions and who goes where, and it all goes straight over my head and I zone out. Everyone jokes that the boys read the war chapters and the girls read the peace chapters, and not to support gender stereotypes on this channel, but I fully felt that on this reread. Also, there are chapters that I personally consider to be indulgences on the part of Tolstoy, like, for example, a scene where Nikolai Rostov and company go on a hunt. It is character significant in the slightest of ways, mostly providing atmosphere, but more importantly, I remember a similar hunt scene in Anna Karenina that was also barely character significant, so I consider this to be an indulgence on Tolstoy's part, like, he loved to hunt, so there's going to be a hunt scene. But I also read a research article that literally started with the importance of this hunt scene, so what do I know? But overall, my personal opinion is that Tolstoy is not difficult to read. He does not overcomplicate his prose, and even if his single sentence can take up half of the page, it's not unwieldy. You get through it pretty quickly. This bite-sized chapter structure allows Tolstoy to move the narrative threads along and keep the reader engaged. So while all of this might seem insurmountable, it truly isn't. You just need to give it a little bit of time. We read War and Peace in school, and it's a constant source of debate as to whether or not it's actually reasonable to expect 15-year-olds to read all of this. I actually do not know where I stand on this. There is an argument made that if we don't read War and Peace in school, then we will lose it as a cultural staple, and that's probably true. What is also true is that expecting teenagers to read all of this and not the CliffsNotes version is also not reasonable. Teenagers who read will read it regardless of the school curriculum, and those who don't won't read it even if you force it on them. However, this is the copy from my school years, and I also used it as I was prepping for my entrance exams into uni, as one of the essay questions could have been about War and Peace. It ended up being something else, but regardless, it has all of these sticky notes and notes inside of it from my school years. And War and Peace is actually a pretty good book if you want to study literature. The way that Tolstoy uses the various literary techniques and tools, such as juxtaposition and compositions, foreshadowing, allusions, metaphors, etc., it's all fairly straightforward. I don't want to say on the nose, it's Tolstoy after all, but sometimes he has the subtlety of sledgehammer while using such devices. The easiest example to use here is when Andrei returns from Austerlitz. He's presumed dead by his sister and father, so he's quite literally coming back from the dead while his wife dies in childbirth, this juxtaposition of life and death, if you will. But at other times, Tolstoy is incredibly nuanced in the way that he uses these devices. One of the researchers pointed out that Tolstoy only describes the eyes of 3 characters in this entire novel, and not the ones that you would think. Eyes, the windows to the soul. Only Kutuzov, Tushin, and Platon Karatayev, the 3 characters that come closest to true understanding of life, at least in Tolstoy's opinion. I cannot actually double-check this claim about the eyes, so we'll have to trust this one researcher's word for it. But Tolstoy is not subtle in his writing in general. An example that I can share with you is towards the end of the book, when Petya Rostov, the youngest son, arrives in Denisov's partisan unit, and Tolstoy spends a lot of time describing him, this young boy, how good-natured he is, how open to the world, a little naive, but so wholesome with his bag of raisins that he shares with everyone. And I was reading that, I was like, oh my god, he's gonna kill him. Petya was featured throughout the book, but not described in much detail. But here, Tolstoy spends a lot of time describing him to me to only deliver an emotional punch later. He was making me fall in love with this boy only to take him away from me. But weirdly, Petya's death is not even described in much detail. Tolstoy uses the familiarization technique here to highlight the cruelty of war, I guess, here, how the youngest are lost for nothing. This lack of subtlety goes further. For instance, you can always tell the way Tolstoy feels about his characters. The nice way of viewing that is that Tolstoy always looks at his characters' actions through the lens of morality and praises those who do good and condemns those who don't. Thus, we can almost divide his characters into good and bad, heroes and villains, as if we're reading a children's book. The good, like Pierre, Andrei, and Natasha, not only get more screen time, but they're also allowed a personal transformation, they're dynamic, while the bad, like Kuragins, are static, frozen in their depravity. The easiest example here is Andrei and Anatol are both wounded in Borodino, but Andrei is then allowed the final step in his transformation where he actually learns the answer to life and death, seemingly, and Anatol simply disappears from the story and dies off screen. Same for Hélène, for example, who basically gets killed off by Tolstoy because it's finally time for Pierre to marry Natasha. Characters like Hélène, they're the static figures, or statues in her case, that Tolstoy has no sympathy for, so they can be removed at a moment's whim. I probably would have preferred the bad characters to have a little bit more to them, like for Helene to be a little bit more than a cardboard cutout of a woman, but Tolstoy only provides a one-dimensional view of her since he believes her to be the epitome of sin or whatever. The thing to remember, however, is that Tolstoy, for all of his accolades, is not the ultimate authority on morality, so approach his views on his characters with caution. The easiest example are the Balkonsky, both father and son, who are viewed positively by Tolstoy, but have significant character flaws to them. And so don't take Tolstoy's word for it, use your own critical thinking and make your own judgments on these characters. But these same rules apply to the historical figures that Tolstoy has in his book, where Kutuzov represents the good and Napoleon the bad. The characterization of the three main historical figures, like Napoleon, Alexander I, and Kutuzov, is warped to fit the narrative. In a way, they are just as fictional as Pierre or Natasha. In simplest terms, Tolstoy uses Kutuzov, a war general, as someone who's willing to lose a battle to stop the war. Not win the war, stop it. Tolstoy was known for his pacifist views. He saw war as this disease that destroys everything in its wake, taking lives and wreaking havoc. And so Kutuzov, as the epitome of virtue in the body of a grandpa, stands up against the entire military, defies his Tsar's orders to put an end to war. He makes decisions that are meant to spare as many lives as he can, even if it means letting Napoleon take Moscow. And Napoleon, thus in an antipode to Kutuzov, instead of being this great strategist and military chief, becomes a small man with great pride and ambitions beyond his reach. Tolstoy says it time and time again that Napoleon believed that he was in control, that the battles won were his accomplishment, but Tolstoy believes war to be something unpredictable and uncontrollable, and thus all of these decisions of Napoleon were of no use. This stuck with me. Tolstoy constantly underplaying the importance of a figure of Napoleon, how his decisions were of no consequence once the war was set in motion. Tolstoy even questions the reasons for the beginning of war, how Napoleon marched on Russia because the continental blockade was broken and the annexation of West Galicia was not viewed favorably by Russia. Is this really why thousands of people marched to kill each other? It is not a good enough answer for Tolstoy. Tolstoy seems to believe in fate, or God's will, or Schopenhauer's idea of will, something that guides us all, something beyond our reach or understanding, but that is something that is ultimately responsible for everything and is in control, especially of the masses. If we want to go more secular, it's almost the idea of collective unconscious that guides us in a situation like war, where an action of an individual soldier is just as important as Napoleon. And I think there is some truth to it, but I also think that stripping the actors of Napoleon's magnitude of their agency and thus accountability and responsibility is the way to go either. I keep thinking about it, partially because Tolstoy comes back to this idea multiple times throughout the book, but also mostly because of the current events and the constant societal discussion on collective and individual responsibility. There is some food for thought here. But it also calls into question our idea of history, how individualistic it is, how when we study history we focus on kings and lords of it all, a handful of people, while completely ignoring millions of others. And for Tolstoy, it's that more interesting to look at the people, at the nation, how it responds in a moment of crisis. He credits the people and not the Alexander I and the Bagratións of the world for the defeat of Napoleon in Russia. Tolstoy is not necessarily disregarding the events of history here, he's simply providing a different lens to look at them through. And as far as historical accuracy goes, Tolstoy exists in this weird in-between space. He did spend a lot of time in archives studying the real accounts of battles and all. He also had his own experience from Crimean War, but he takes all of that knowledge that he has and he not necessarily throws it away, but he fictionalizes it. He was criticized for it in his lifetime even, how his depictions of battles of Austerlitz and Borodino are far from accurate. Or even now, historians list hundreds of mild inaccuracies that are not plot significant but annoy historians. Like, for example, how Andrei and Natasha couldn't have been dancing the waltz at the ball because the waltz had just been invented and Andrei wouldn't have had the time to learn it. Like, who cares? Tolstoy is not trying for accuracy. He, even within the text, is in constant conversation with historians on how to treat history. He acknowledges the universally accepted account of the events and then goes and does his own thing. Because for him, it's that much more important to tell the story, and he will bend to the historical events if that helps him to tell the story. On the flip side, he also tries to convey this atmosphere of the epoch. Like, for example, he adds pages of French text in the beginning of the story because Russian aristocracy at the time spoke French better than Russian. And later in the book, he also highlights how this same aristocracy was struggling with Russian when French fell out of fashion. And in doing so, he brings the reader into the time period. Basically, he is accurate when it suits him, and he's willing to throw away the rules if it doesn't. So research advised not to view this novel as a historical novel, but rather an epic or even a mythological novel, because the world that Tolstoy creates is a fictionalized version of our world, a mythologized one even. But if Tolstoy has created a myth, to what end? If you really want to understand War and Peace, pay close attention in Volume 3. In my opinion, that's where Tolstoy's ideas come into full bloom. There's this discussion on the role of man in history, on how we view history in general, and this idea of fate that guides us all, and the freedom that comes when you accept death. Because the true freedom was displayed by the Russian soldiers on the battlefield, because they existed on this edge between life and death, and thus they were truly free. That's something that Prince Andrei will learn in Volume 3, and something that Platon Karataev is going to teach Pierre there as well. This theme of death is important to Tolstoy, not only in this book. I highly recommend that you read The Death of Ivan Ilyich if you haven't already. It's rather poignant. In War and Peace, death comes for quite a few characters, and researchers also point out how differently Tolstoy describes his characters' deaths. Like, for example, Prince Andrei dies even before his actual medical death, or Kutuzov, where Tolstoy simply goes, there was nothing left for him to do, and so he died. But death is important thematically, as the acceptance of it is key to understanding life. That's something that Pierre goes through multiple times throughout the story, first with the duel and the Freemasons, but he fails time and time again. He still asks himself why and what for. He fears death. And for Tolstoy, true enlightenment comes only when you stop asking yourself such questions. We see it in Andrei. When he accepts death, he finds this serenity. His death can be viewed as the new beginning in a religious sense, if you will, because Tolstoy is still religious at this point in his timeline. In essence, this pursuit of truth or any other aims that you might envision for yourself need to be replaced by faith. And that's how you can actually accept death as simply a step in your journey, since true understanding is impossible for a man, at least on this plane of existence. Andrei's death ends with an open question as to what happens to him now. Natasha asks, where has he gone? So Tolstoy does not have all of the answers here. Death remains a mystery. Tolstoy's philosophy is religious, but not explicitly, so you can still view it more secularly. The religious elements break through in Platon Karataev. His whole image is all about being part of this greater whole of God's plan, if you will. And it was recently explained to me, the Orthodox teachings are based on this metaphor that God is everything and everything is God. So when Pierre accepts himself as part of this greater whole, he is at his happiest. He has found faith. And that's a significant step in his journey. Another thing that helps in understanding Tolstoy is a term that he coined, dialectic of the soul. It is a detailed representation of the process that encompasses the point of origin and subsequent formation of a person's thoughts, feelings, moods, sensations, their synergy, their development, display of the mental process itself, its patterns and forms. Tolstoy is an all-knowing narrator. He's privy to the deepest thoughts and feelings of his characters, and so he gets to present them to us. But showing isn't enough. He strives not to provide an analysis, really, but at the very least to look at the connections between words and actions, emotions and their expressions, and how all of these things evolve in his characters over the course of the story. I don't want to spend too much time talking about the personal transformations of Tolstoy's characters in this video. As I've said already, only a few choice characters get to go through a personal transformation in Tolstoy's story. Most remain static. If you want to imagine a circle where at the center of it is the total understanding of life and death, happiness and life's purpose, acceptance and faith, then there are only a few characters who are already here, notably Platon, Karataev and Kutuzov. They don't undergo much change over the course of the story because they've already reached this space. Further from the center are characters like Pierre and Andrei, who are in constant pursuit of this truth. They are looking for this meaning, making mistakes along the way, worshipping the wrong gods and ideals along the way, but they never stop looking. Andrei comes to some sort of the realization on his deathbed, while Pierre in the epilogue is once again seduced by the pursuit of something, and thus he lost the teachings of Platon Karataev that could have moved him closer to the center. Furthest from the center are characters who cannot be further from the truth, the Kuragins and the Dolokhovs of the world, who are fully consumed by their baser instincts, who don't even know to look for the truth. So they remain static and there is no evolution or transformation or change possible for them. Arguably, this is how Tolstoy views his characters, since the constant pursuit of the truth is the true meaning of life, since true knowledge is unattainable. Characters like Kutuzov or Karataev seem almost outerworldly, godlike, in a sense that they've already learned this truth, so they stand above everybody else in this life, and this life's problems mean nothing to them. Kutuzov during the Battle of Borodino is depicted eating chicken because there is nothing that he can do at that point to make any effect on the outcome of the battle. Pierre in the same moment is also at Borodino at the Redoute doing nothing, but Pierre is still in the early stages of his personal transformation, so he's nowhere near Kutuzov's understanding of life. I'm not going to cover the personal journey of Pierre or Andrei in this video. It's all in the book, it's all fairly straightforward. I only want to mention Natasha here. Natasha from the start is depicted as this epitome of goodness, somebody that attracts everybody to her, even somebody as cool, as rational as Andrei. She's often described as this lively, vibrant life. She's intuitive, she doesn't deign to be smart, and her actions are entirely driven by fate. Out of all of characters, Natasha probably comes closest to Karataev's understanding of life, but while Karataev is all about acceptance and humility in a very Christian way, Natasha is all about passion and the life force. Her journey thus, and especially her affair with Anatole, is not even about her character development, but more to show how corruptible goodness truly is. Besides, deep personal developments are reserved for male characters. Shall we mention Tolstoy's misogyny? Natasha's transformation in the epilogue was instantly noticed by the critics, who raised questions and concerns about her becoming this doting wife only concerned for her husband and children, or as Tolstoy calls her, strong, handsome and fertile woman. Except he doesn't call her a woman, he calls her samka, a word that means female animal, and is not used to describe women unless you want to get slapped. Researchers now try and justify Natasha's transformation, claiming that her passionate nature had no true outlet in her single days and now found it in her family life, so she threw herself into it fully head first. And that very well might be, but I cannot shake off the meta-narrative here. And the meta-narrative is Tolstoy himself. As I read the epilogue, I couldn't stop thinking about what I know about Tolstoy and his family life and how it seems like he's projecting here. Natasha takes on a few character traits of Tolstoy's wife Sofia, but she also becomes this idealized version of a woman, at least in Tolstoy's opinion, because a woman, according to him, needs to only be focused on her husband and children and have no wants and ambitions beyond that, something that Sofia tried and failed to achieve because Tolstoy's expectations were not always reasonable. There's a bit in there where Natasha insists on breastfeeding all of her children because it makes her feel like a woman or whatever, and it felt like a mean dig because Sofia Tolstoy, on their third child, she developed a breast condition that made breastfeeding incredibly painful for her, and she was even forbidden by the doctor from doing so. But Tolstoy forced her to breastfeed all of her children because it was her duty as a woman and a mother. He was not a good husband. I'm sorry, but my heart always bleeds for Sofia and all of that she had to endure from her genius husband. But Natasha is this ideal woman who knows her place, who knows not to make any excuses, she doesn't deign to be smart or whatever. But it's not just Natasha. Nikolai also takes on few of Tolstoy's own characteristics, like, for example, he goes to work with the men, just like Tolstoy started doing. And arguably, Nikolai's transformation is just as unsubstantiated as Natasha's. It feels like it's only there for meta reasons, i.e. Tolstoy's ideals sneaking into the text. But on the flip side, the epilogue presents us with two happy families, at least in the way that Tolstoy views happiness, but happy endings nevertheless. I've recently posted a joke in my shorts about how all of Russian literature seems to be based on suffering. And there is a little bit of it here, but War and Peace might very well be the most positive book out of top 10 of Russian literature. This statement obviously comes with caveats. You might shed a tear or two over some character's fate here, but the driving force, the emotion at the core of War and Peace, is not suffering. I'm not too well ingrained in Tolstoy's philosophy of life that he eventually turned into a religion. It also evolved over the course of his life, but from what I understand, he was always looking for happiness. He eventually found it in a life of a peasant, like few possessions, hard work, but simple joys and contentment. It's a little bit more obvious in Anna Karenina and Levin, but even here, that's kind of Pierre's journey. First with the Freemasons, but then with Platon Karataev and all. He's always looking for peace. Echoes of Tolstoy's beloved lifestyle are even in the epilogue with Nikolai, but Nikolai does not fully embrace it. But still, the point is that Tolstoy's characters are looking for this happiness and joy of life, something that only Natasha has from the start. That's actually something that differentiates Tolstoy from, say, Dostoevsky, who couldn't look away from the darkness. In the end, well, there is obviously no single opinion on this book. Some love it, some hate it. I do think it's a book worth reading. There is this layer of simply good fiction, if you enjoy 19th century period dramas, but it also goes deeper. And while I don't agree with all of the aspects of Tolstoy's philosophy of life, it provides good food for thought. And that's what timeless literature is all about, after all.